So as someone involved in starting up businesses in India, and let me just extrapolate from that because I belong to a different socioeconomic class and just expand it to entrepreneurship in general. I think there's basically 5 sets of barriers to entrepreneurship. The first is regulatory and governance related, which is, it is not an easy environment in which you can do a startup or an easy environment in which you can do business because, the government said, the policy mechanisms just aren't good enough for that. Number 2, access to finance, and that is just across the board. I mean, higher debt, equity, hybrid. It is very difficult for an entrepreneur to access early stage capital. Number 3, access to markets. If you have a product, how do you get it out to the market? And that's a very key problem. Number 4, access to what I broadly speaking call access to knowledge networks, best practices, and technology. So in the absence of that, what you see is a lot of reinvention of the wheel that happens as a consequence. And finally, access to just skills, because to grow from small to large, you need people. And getting people today is a very, very large problem in India, including at the managerial level, at the blue-collar level, it's all a problem. So I'd say these are, broadly speaking, the 5 sets of transaction costs that you run into as an entrepreneur. I think education reform is vital in India. Now, whether reforms are going to happen or not is an entirely different question. But let's look at the macro numbers. By 2025, India needs about 700 million trained people, of which 200 million need to be educated in universities, 500 million need to be educated vocationally, just basic skills. How are we going to get there? That's a very, very hard question. And if we continue at our current trajectory, we're not going to get anywhere near there. So there is a whole set of reforms that need to be put into place because the government is well aware of the fact that, the line between a demographic dividend, which every Indian talks about because, we're the youngest country on the planet, 20% of the global workforce is going to be Indian by 2025, all of those things. That's the positive side. But the line between a demographic dividend and a demographic nightmare is a very thin one. And if you don't get the education process, together in very quick time, you can slip into the demographic nightmare scenario because there is nothing worse than a very young population without jobs. Now, in terms of, are reforms necessary in education? Absolutely. So, for starts, you need to give up the notion that education institutions cannot make profits. You need a very large amount of private sector money to come into the space. Now, my worry is that the government, either doesn't understand the lay of the land when it comes to education or is behind the curve. So in terms of understanding the lay of the land, what I mean by that is if you look at low-income education, it is, especially amongst the, in the urban setting amongst the poor, about 80% of urban slum dwellers, for instance, today send their kids to private schools, okay? And this is just a fact. Now, you can either encourage the process or you find ways to put barriers in there. Now, if you look at the fine print in some of the education bills that are being discussed, there is actually clauses in there that would send these 300,000 to 400,000 low-income private schools underground or force them to shut down. So the government needs to rethink some of the stuff that they're doing by way of policy in education. So on the issue of social mobility, I think I'm extremely optimistic about social mobility for one very simple reason, urbanization. It is the single largest secular sort of macro trend that you're seeing across India and across China, Africa, etc. as well. But in India, what you're looking at is about 300 million people to 400 million people are basically going to migrate to cities in the next, say, 20 to 30 years. And that's just a fact. I mean, they're already moving. And the first thing that breaks down when you move to a city are the old social systems, the old social norms, all of those collapse because, caste systems, all of those things. So if you're riding in a subway train, you don't have a choice as to who you're standing next to, et cetera, et cetera. So I think urbanization is going to drive social mobility by and large. And this, by the way, is something that, a lot of Indian political leaders back in the 1940s had actually figured out because if you look at the framer of our constitution, the person who wrote our constitution, a gentleman by the name of Dr. Ambedkar, I mean, Dr. Ambedkar was an untouchable. And one of his sort of rallying calls in the 1940s was to basically, he was telling fellow untouchables that the way to escape the caste system and the untouchability system was to migrate into cities in very large numbers. And in that time, he actually took on no less than Gandhi, who had this notion of the Republic of Villages. He actually took on Gandhi ferociously to encourage his people to actually move into cities. So, thankfully that has finally come to fruition and people are moving en masse. So that process of urbanization is actually what makes me very, very optimistic about social mobility.